Welcome to my Loyalist clothing presentation. After viewing this, you will be able to develop a Loyalist look using recommendations presented here, and you will have learned how to avoid common missteps. I will not be covering Indigenous Loyalists since that is not an area of my research, and it could be inappropriate for me to present outside my culture. Similarly, I will only briefly touch on the clothing of Black Loyalists. I strongly believe that we learn deeply with images and that historical context increases understanding. So please enjoy and absorb. Things to consider. I'm a smidge particular about some aspects of historical accuracy, but I also realize that we need to set our own boundaries about that. I will include some cheats that help make this all possible. There is a 7-page handout that will be available to help you find resources that I will mention and some that I will not mention. These include books, websites, and videos. I recommend saving it electronically because using the links are just easier that way. This day in Ottawa, I was demonstrating an underlayer with numerous items. I was wearing a shift, corset, hip roll, petticoat, and holding my skirt hanging at the side. That day I cheated with a tank top under the shift, since it is quite sheer. And we see a participant opposite who used a few dress-up items, including a fichu, bodice, cap, and apron. The red item was her own scarf of the day. Like many of you, I spent my school years with textbooks full of images drawn by 20th century artists representing historical periods that they themselves did not experience personally. And with great faith, we sewed what we hoped were historically accurate items from Simplicity and McCall's patterns using zippers and polyester lace. Now we have access to primary documents and historically correct accounts. These two black and white images may not have the accuracy of a photograph, but at least we know they were made at the Loyalist time. I use a research-based approach to Loyalist clothing. If I cannot find proof that it or something quite like it was used, I generally don't use it. Like doing genealogy, I deeply value primary documents. I find that having the context for the clothing and textiles to be very important. As the War of 1812 commemorations approached not long ago, I found myself wanting to become more involved in my Loyalist heritage. I found some generous, spirited reenacting friends at Adolphustown and in Bath. I was quite excited then to learn the whats and whys of the attire of that later War of 1812 era that connected to the Loyalists. I learned from them and the resources they suggested. An obvious error on my part was the visible bangs in the photo of me with my tape loom. In general, women's hair was long, tied back and not seen, and certainly not with fringe or bangs. Gel and bobby pins would have fixed that easily. Men's hair was also often long and tied into a queue, such as those shown, especially in the Loyalist era, or a fake queue is added. I would love it if this were an in-person event so I could hear your ideas and impressions and hopes and ambitions for your Loyalist attire. Those who have heard any of my talks before know how I love involving people and actual tactile items in the presentation. As shown in this image of me, fairly animated, during a talk, perhaps at the Bay of Quinte branch. Now that we've had an introduction, what do we think about Loyalist clothing? Why do we choose to represent Loyalists in clothing? What are our goals? What is our process when we try to do this? What aspects of then and now do we consider? Where did we learn what we think is accurate? When using the internet and other sources, how can we know what sources to rely on? Why do we call it attire or clothing rather than costume? We could call it historic representation. Reenactors call the person they portray and clothe a persona or a portrayal. Costume makes me think of laughable, absurd, ill-fitting Halloween items made of thin synthetic or wrong fabric with only a passing attention to historical details. And this sometimes includes theater or film costumes, where aspects are heightened or just wrong. So let's not use that costume word if we can learn to avoid it. Some of the images here are Halloween costumes and others are from films. Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean. It was set in 1728. They used the scarlet redcoats for the British military, but used the ones that were not correct until after the mid-1700s. The earlier ones that might have been correct were madder red, like the image left of Mr. Depp. And they were a different shape than the commonly seen misused War of 1812 redcoat style coats. In the upper center is a very famous TV costuming skit. Carol Burnett and Harvey Korman in November 1976 with their portrayal of a famous scene from Gone with the Wind that had just been re-released on TV a couple of weeks earlier. This was a memorable, humorous moment in costuming for TV and film. If you haven't seen it, look for it on YouTube. It's wonderful. Where did you learn about Loyalist attire? None of these images are primary sources. It's important to determine what is accurate and what is not, so you can create your Loyalist clothing plan. I do a great deal of research for any Loyalist clothing project, just as I would for a theater costume design. I prioritize looking at images of museum extant garments, at recommended books, and at well-regarded websites. Pinterest can be dangerous in its inaccuracy, a bit like some shared family trees with the wrong uncle attributed to the family. Many sources from the 20th century contained misconceptions about Loyalist clothing. Our mid-1900s history textbooks were full of C.W. Jeffreys images that were created between 1920 and 1960 and published widely that certainly did increase general awareness of history. So we can credit him that. But some contain images that are inconsistent with more recent research. The Loyalist woman in the drawing lots images, black and white, upper right-ish, may have been Scots due to the kirch she is wearing on her head. That item is not generally worn by Loyalists of other cultures. The lower center images is also likely familiar and was by David John Kelly of about 1937. We have the opportunity now to step aside from these artistic impressions and examine primary sources. We have the advantage right now of online or published access to images of museum garments, as well as newly discovered or analyzed accounts of historical events. These provide the opportunity to get closer to the circumstances of our ancestors and therefore understand their clothing better, among other things. Although the intent and symbolism is deeply respected, our evocative and treasured UEL statue has a few not typical details for the women's Loyalist dress. Chiefly, the front center gathered opening is possibly from a gown or a bodice created pre-1763. She is not wearing any sort of fichu, and there are many ruffles on the dress that many ordinary Loyalists would not have been able to afford. As early researchers, we were generally influenced by colonial Williamsburg dresses, such as the one lower left. It also depicts a time before the Loyalist era, although there is some overlap. This dress also has the front crisscross ties from pre-1763. Williamsburg, Virginia was a key center from about 1699 till 1780, but it was not chiefly Loyalist. It was the site of a conflict between the colonial leadership and the disgruntled patriots in 1775. Both the fashions of the 1950s and the garment styles from Williamsburg had influence on the US Civil War centennial patterns, our 1967 patterns, the USA 1976 bicentennial patterns. And this was evident with the bias tape, ruffles, zippers, polycotton fabrics, and mob caps. These outfits were very often not historically correct, despite much hard work using the accepted and respected resources of the time. Sources of the 1980s now should be regarded cautiously. Luckily, with additional historic resources available so easily, we can now up our game. When looking for resources in books and on the internet, it helps to know what sources we can trust. In general, on the internet, if the site you find is a commercial or is an advertisement, then the content may be in doubt. Look at the resources that are included here and in the handout that are reliable. I have included a few that are not recommended, so you can avoid those. Even a site with some excellent items can have some that are less good. Let's look at the clothing items that existed from the time periods around the Loyalist era. On the left are a few items from the pre-1763 era. These include the French and Indian Wars, Battle of the Plains of Abraham at Quebec in 1759, and 1763 Treaty of Paris. In the center are images from the period of the American Revolution. This is part of the Georgian era, in which there were a number of Georges. The Rev War went from 1774-ish to about 1783, or actually 1790, until things were well calmed down. The Simcoe era is next, named for Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. It covered 1791 to 96. Then followed Regency and the War of 1812. Regency was a large section of time, 1795 to 1837, with the War of 1812 and to 1815 in between. Of course, these designations are approximate in terms of fashion, since people gradually change things when they wear, as they wear things with the seasons and as things wore out, sometimes replacing them with slightly different items or modifying items to suit the fashion, and only following fashion trends when finance is allowed, just as now, sometimes with a few items carried over from earlier days. When you decide to make or acquire Loyalist attire, consider the following. First of all, as I've clarified, it's not a costume. Its purpose is to help you and your viewers see in textile items additional aspects of your own Loyalist ancestry. This may include their trades, skills, war experiences, and help each understand the rebuilding of their lives and creating their legacies. Number two, try to define your goals and how will you use these Loyalist clothing items? Is it for a once-a-year flag raising? Is this for hot or cold weather, or both? What will the ground be like at these events? Field, yard, dry, wet, soft, hard? Choose footwear that will work for your own individual feet. Do you need different items for different seasonal activities? If your annual group event is berry picking, perhaps choose darkish colored clothing at your knees at least. Certainly use headwear and possibly a lighter colored top suitable for sunny hot weather. A third area would be to determine at least a vague sense of your person's social class, heritage, and the location you wish to represent. Some sense of this can be gained from the UK American Loyalist claims 1776 to 1835 that are available on Ancestry and other places, or for Ontario settlers, the report of the Bureau of Archives for the Province of Ontario, second report 1904. Those links are in the handout. These documents would tell you about their land, their affluence, what type of farming they were doing if they were farmers, and that will help inform your choices about representing your ancestor. Were they wearing the attire of the most well-off families in big cities? How long had they been in North America? Were they run off their farms with only the clothes on their backs? I doubt that you can narrow down the time of year or season when they fled, except in some well-documented situations. Rarely you may be able to determine which clothing might clearly represent their nationality. This might be the case for Scots and German descent, but for all Loyalists, there's more information available now than we knew 20 or 40 years ago. Item number 4 would be to choose a specific era as laid out previously. There are differences, and the wearing of a collection of items from different eras will give some observers concern. Unless you're portraying an older person still wearing styles from previous times all muddled together. We know some people who still do that today. I am in no way an expert about the attire of Black Loyalists, but I will share something from that era. In the Caribbean, there was an artist from about 1770 to 96, Agostino Brunias, who was an Italian painter who was primarily active in the West Indies. This painting is called Free Women of Color with Their Children and Servants. It is described as follows. His paintings represent an important foundation of visual culture in the colonial Caribbean. The brightly patterned textiles depicted here in this market scene on the island of Dominica attest to the symbolic importance of these textiles for free women of color who both sold and wore these fabrics as assertions of their freedom. My sense is that many Black Loyalists wore much the same general styles as their owner families at a lesser status level. This understanding comes from the runaway ads and other contemporary newspaper notices. In the shown image, the woman in the red bodice on the far left is wearing what would be called a short gown. Or sometimes, if this garment is longer, it may be called a bedgown. These items are referred to in the ads, the runaway ads as well. In the green in the upper left, it says a red baize bedgown. So when they refer to that, the image on the left with the woman in the red stripes, that is a bedgown. We will look at how to make this in part 2 of this talk. There are other terms in the newspaper ads that are worth looking up. These include fabric names that are unfamiliar to you right now. Here is a North Carolina magazine for 1764 listing fabrics that were available at that time. A couple that are important would include broadcloth, which you would think might be the broadcloth of now, but it is actually wool. Taffety, which is the same as taffeta, except it wasn't polyester. I have put the link to this particular newspaper image and this list of fabrics I've also placed in the handout. If this talk were a college course, we could explore each and every one of these fabrics. But given the situation, you will be able to take these names and do some more with your online independent research. In addition to Agostino Brunias, who else can we turn to as an artist of the era? There were no cameras, so we need some illustrated documentation that we can count on. Written descriptions are useful, but can be lacking and are up to interpretation. Usually in this era, an artist officer was included with a military unit. This lower image is of Quebec City. The title is very long. By the same man, there's a map of Nova Scotia made about 1785. Cape Breton was a separate territory at that time, and you'll notice that it Seems not to be on the map. So do you know this artist? He is exactly who we need. He was qualified, lived at the time of the Loyalists, traveled among them, and traveled from Quebec City and did his survey and map work for Samuel Holland between 1773 and 1784. This included surveying the north shore of Lake Ontario to Niagara. And along the way, he created the images of many waterfronts. James Peachey was a well-regarded surveyor, draftsman, army officer, and artist. He also did the illustrations for Daniel Klaus's 1786-87, the Book of Common Prayer and Gospel according to St. Mark, translated into the Mohawk language by Captain Joseph Brant. Peachey's involvement in this project makes me feel pleased to feel that he may have been at least partly a bridge builder. So how do James Peachey's works help us now? We can see the lay of the land in many parts of the regions being settled. We can see vessels, structures, waterfronts, peoples, their activities, and their clothing. All of this context is seen in his works, and we can believe him since he was a skilled and respected contemporary of the Loyalists. For me, this gives the context and shows some excellent details from a trusted contemporary source. He did an illustration of Captain Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, in 1786. Also, these blow-ups from his artworks show sufficient details of the Loyalist arrivals at their new settlements and their clothing. And for the reenactors listing, the squarish pots in the lower left would provide a suggestion of proof for the use of tin pots rather than only heavy iron. And the depicted cook sets looks more wooden than wrought iron too. It seems that he portrayed the women wearing canizou as a scarf, or at least a fichu worn in the non-tucked in French manner. We'll get to that soon. Therefore, it is important that we know where he traveled and when, so that what we learn from his images and how we apply them can be used as accurately as possible. In my Loyalist clothing research, I have focused on a mid to lower class persona, since many or most Loyalists, even if they had been well off in 1772, likely became considerably less affluent due to the rebellion losses. They may have had to uproot their lives with little time to plan, pack, and they had little choice of transportation. So they might take anything they could carry, in addition to infants, toddlers, and maybe some food. Can we actually wear items from the late 1700s, 18th century? No, they are mostly long disintegrated, and what exists, maybe in museums, would be too brittle and would not fit. And there are very few of them. Can we use items from current days? Let's see why or why not. How can we find a middle ground between historically accurate replica items, modern clothing of 2021, and actual items from 1776 to 1815? Are you familiar with Venn diagrams? What we are aiming for, theoretically, is that pink triangle in the very center, meeting many of the criteria of historically accurate items, but making the project of Loyalist clothing manageable. So what are some key aspects of our current clothing? In 2021, we can use any shape or length desired. We have limited tendency towards the focus on the waistline, a dropped or hip waist being more common. We have limited requirements for body coverage, except for temperature. Any type of garment at all. Lingerie is different. Skirts of any length exist. Front closing tops exist with all types of closures visible. Any color, any weight, any texture, any print, weave, or dye, any fabric from breathable monofilament to wool. Natural fabrics can actually be more expensive. Assorted widths are available. Reused fabrics are available. We use sewing machines, zippers, snaps, along with sergers and other industrial processes. But if we look at the items from 1776 Loyalist era time period, natural waste was a key focus, and later a high waist started around 1800. The skirts were long-ish to about ankle length. All sleeves covered elbows all year round. There were a few other norms as well. There was a chemise, a corset, a hip roll, pockets, petticoat, cape, cap, hat, apron. Limited fabric fibers were used. Limited colors were available. Mostly they used linen, hemp, silk, and wool. And of course, silk only to those who could afford it. Cotton was limited. Fabric came in narrower widths than we're accustomed to now. And everything was hand sewn. There were no sewing machines yet. Shoes were plain unless the wearer was wealthy. But since reenactors get very close to historical accuracy, why might UELAC members find this a challenge? There is a cost to hand sewing. It takes a lot of time. And the items that we need may have limited access. I'll get into some of that in a minute. Generally, we may use these items for fewer events than reenactors, and we have a less onerous tradition of accuracy. Fully historical accurate items would require all the correct aspects to be considered. Fiber and weave of the fabric. Items to be made from historically accurate fabrics would likely have to come from the UK or the USA. The garment pattern could have to come from a museum and be resized for an individual and modern body. All items were hand sewn and would require the wearing of all time appropriate base items, including the chemise, the corset, hip roll, pockets, petticoat, jacket, short gown, fichu, kerchief, straight pins, cap, apron, hat, stocking, shoes. Absolutely no modern makeup and jewelry limited to what was appropriate of their class. The female body then was shaped gradually from childhood to suit the styles of the era. These requirements for fully historically accurate items would be prohibitive financially for many people, and the handwork alone is extremely expensive. Reenactors often trade their skills among themselves and build a collection over many years. And as I mentioned, our bodies don't fit into the styles of that time very well. So what can we do? We are aiming again for that pink triangle, what we can actually do. We can make a facsimile, something quite similar. We can use cotton, wool, linen, and all woven fabrics, no knits. T-shirt fabric is a knit, in case you aren't sure. Use no blends that include polyester, lycra, and rayon. Yes, they make things not wrinkle, but that doesn't mean they hang the way things were in Loyalist era. Use plain colored fabrics, not print, unless you're able to very closely have it verified. Choose suitable colors, wear plain shoes, a long skirt to just above the ankle, neutral socks or stockings, keep your elbows covered. In lieu of a corset, possibly try a sports bra with an underbust padding and a stomacher to create a smooth look. Wear a kerchief, fichu, kerch, hip roll, petticoat, pocket with a cap, hat, apron as required. Use no buttons, zippers, visible hooks, visible bias, or twill. Consider your person's status. Use minimal lace and ruffles and not polyester, and no polyester ribbon. A key tip, which is a focus of my approach at the present, save your funds and time available for the things that are visible and that really make the outfit, like your hat and caps for both men and women. The women's flat straw or wool bergère hat is not easily acquired, nor can it be easily made from scratch. Buy hats, but not Halloween quality ones. Likely some of you, other than the sewing folks among us, have not been concerned with fabric details in recent years. The fibers, thicknesses, and weaves all matter for a Loyalist outfit. I have put together detailed information about textiles and their uses in the handout. We will talk more about hats soon. Some cheat points. In a pinch, one could wear a modern shirt if it would not be seen, therefore would be fully covered by a jacket or a vest all the time. And this might possibly include having the collar turned down or removed. One aspect that modern shirts have that Loyalist shirts did not have is the double layered yoke across the shoulders, mostly in the back. Secondly, they had no pockets. Check the shirt you're wearing right now, fellows. Do you find a yoke or a pocket or two? No, t-shirts don't have yokes, and usually no pockets either. Also, a third item is that shirts did not button all the way down and were much longer than shirts these days. Perhaps some of you can visualize Jamie Fraser of Outlander in his shirt. It's very similar. Just because our ancestors were our pioneers did not mean that they wove slubby linen fabric. That would have been shoddy work. Avoid it unless for a specific purpose that you can document, like everything else. Another cheat, I created a two-piece dress from polycotton bed sheets as a trial garment with many pattern adjustments along the way. I did verify that the print was appropriate and the colors were suitable. But due to the polyester content, I did not intend to use it regularly. Later, having run out of time to rebuild it, I wore it as is for some events. At least the print is suitably correct. Only a few people noticed the fiber error, I hope. For warmth, the Loyalist women also could wear a quilted petticoat and possibly a quilted vest. For you, this is another area to cheat. Wear anything you like underneath your visible Loyalist clothing. Just be sure it remains out of the eye of the observer throughout the event. One can layer skirts once you have a few, and one wool layer makes a huge difference. And you can wear leggings or tights underneath as long as you hide them below the knee. Your period appropriate knee socks can go over tights and other socks. Cable knit knee socks were not worn then, as far as we know, perhaps except for the Scots. Textiles, fabric and fiber. Here we have images of two historic fabric books that have been recommended, wearable prints and printed textiles. These are listed in the handout. Next is an image of a three-piece suit of a high-class male. This is a museum set. At that time, and earlier than this, some vests actually had sleeves. Next, we have a sample of a suitable floral block printed dress fabric. This type of floral was usually used for a one-piece dress rather than by a working woman. Working women generally wore separates and plainer fabrics. As we circle around, the lower right is a pinned piece of checked fabric from the samples from infants that were left as orphans at London churches close to the Loyalist time period. These fabric samples are shown in a book with the heart titled Threads of Feeling, and some are online when you search that title. Next is a well-worn museum corset. It is pronounced corset, set or sut with an E or almost a U, or soot. Not like corvette, corset. They were also commonly called stays. Not all had straps, or they were removable, and in this particular case, they may have become lost. Next, we have a worn piece of mostly red India printed floral chintz. And above that, with a quarter placed on it for scale, this tan and red sample fabric is my polyester cotton sheets for my trial run outfit that I kept wearing anyway. And similarly, print of this type would have been used for a one-piece dress, not the two-piece that I made. Oops. We can use museum items and well-researched books to better understand the textiles that were available then and there. Due to trade problems with Europe leading up to and during the Revolution, some textiles were in low supply until things resettled after the war. So what was available? Some supply of homemade wool, linen, which was made from flax, and very little else. Little was made during the Revolution. Leading up to and during the conflict, England reserved all textile manufacturing for the factories in England, and they prohibited such manufacturing in the colonies as well. And they prohibited trade to the colonies. Through the Revolution, pride was taken by the patriots that made at home was a goal to strive for. And certainly made at home was the only way to have access to other fabrics. There are many potential trip-ups for terminology in the textile area. One example previously mentioned is that Loyalist era broadcloth, as listed previously, was a coat weight wool. So choose carefully. What garments are the key items for creating a Loyalist look? As you can see here, the shift and shirt is hardly seen when one is fully dressed. So should we focus on hand sewing the least visible items? Maybe not. A female would wear that list: hose, shoes, stays, a hip roll, petticoat, pair of pockets, top or bodice or jacket, skirt, corset, possibly a one-piece gown, apron, fichu, cap, and hat. For a male, it would be the shirt, add hose, breeches, shoes, waistcoat, vest, cravat, neckerchief, coat, and hat. For many men, their clothing would be issued provincial militia wear, although there is some evidence that for many militia volunteers, uniforms would not have been received right away. In the handout, there are links to videos for reference about the order of these layers. Being able to display the correct silhouette gives a strong impression from a distance, and that may be of more value than spending time, money, and energy on accurate underthings, but missing the right hat. I suggest that when planning to assemble a Loyalist look, consider learning about the accessories first. I propose that a male or female could fulfill much of a Loyalist look using plain, modern, basic items with some modification for top and bottom while paying attention to their accessories. We will look at more of these in part 2. End of part 1.